This is 91.3 FM, WCW in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Dr. Chris Radio of Horror show. And tonight on Radio of Horror, we have Cody Merrick, the director of the Scary Stories documentary, which were a bunch of children's books that a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s probably read in middle school and elementary school, with some very creepy graphic art depicted in them and truly terrifying stories. And Cody has put together a documentary telling us of the history of these books that we loved in our childhood. Thank you for coming on the show with us, Cody.
Thank you so much for having me.
How did this documentary get started? Did it just come from your love of the same stories that we all read as a kid?
Sure. Initially, though, I kind of had the idea of doing a documentary on the importance of children's books, children's literature. That's kind of my background. So, but you usually need or it's helpful to have some kind of vessel for like telling an interesting story. And when I thought about these books and how popular they still were, and I'm the perfect age. I'm in my mid-30s right now, so I was one of those in my 20s that kind of was reminded of these books and was like, oh yeah, I love those when I was a kid. And so you combine that with the fact that they're very popular and have remained a very big nostalgia title for a lot of people, but then also combined with the fact that they were heavily censored. They were number one on the banned or challenged children's books list in the 1990s, which was the first time a decade list had been compiled for it, and then and they were still in the top 10 in the between 2000 and 2009. So they've been you have a really interesting juxtaposition because you have a title that people very fondly remember and got them interested in reading, in art, in folklore, and they're heavily censored. So you have a really cool story there.
Do you have to seek down copyright for this type of documentary because it's based on books, or is it because it's a documentary it's going to be considered educational? You don't have to worry about copyright problems?
Technically, no, but I actually have in collaboration with the Alvin Schwartz family. I've already interviewed Barbara Schwartz's wife, who's well in her 80s now, and I've interviewed other family members, and they own the copyright. Now, they've optioned for it to be adapted into a film. That's ongoing. That's been in development about as long as I've been working on this documentary. So I do have to be a little careful, but it is a documentary. It's not an adaptation, which a film for the film that they're working on, CBS Films has optioned for, is a adaptation. This is a documentary, so it's telling a wholly different thing. So technically, I don't have to worry about it, but I guess in a way I do, because there's a way to do a documentary where you're not stepping on, I can't actually adapt these stories, if that makes sense. But I'm not planning on it because it's a documentary.
Explain a little bit about who some of the people that you mentioned are, for anyone not familiar with their names.
Sure. So Alvin Schwartz was the author. These books, there were 3 books in the original in the series, and they were published between 1981 and 1991. And the author, Alvin Schwartz, he passed away just a year after that last book. And so there's never been... And so an interesting part of this is it's kind of a book we'll never see that author and that illustrator compiling this series ever again. And people very nostalgically remember those books. So anyway, so the author passed away. I've been in contact and been talking with the family, his family, for the last almost 2 years, and so and I've interviewed some of them, and some of them I'm still planning on interviewing. So Barbara Schwartz was his wife, and I've interviewed her, and she was just lovely. I've interviewed his daughter, and during the same trip, and then I plan to at least interview his son Peter Schwartz, who's on the West Coast that I haven't made to yet. So I've interviewed family members. I also have other interviews. I interviewed R.L. Stine just a couple months ago. UL Pierce, if you look up, there was another popular book series at that time, Scary Stories for Sleepovers, and she's the author of that. So a number of interviews with the whole genre of, and it really has grown. R.L. Stine's kind of the biggest name in the genre, but I think the Scary Stories books is a fantastic other example of a genre that's really blew up in the 80s and 90s, but is still very popular. And nowadays you have a lot of other titles that kind of, cater to a lot of kids who are naturally interested in scary books. So, some authors, and then the fact that this is, folklore. I've interviewed folklorists, I've interviewed scholars in children's books and that sort of thing. So it's very much about these books, but it's also kind of about the natural interest of kids in wanting to read these kinds of books at a certain age.
What were some of the stories in the Scary Story novels? There were 3 of them, weren't there?
Yes, there are 3.
Okay, 3 of them that really stood out to you. Which stories in particular? One from each. Let's just say one story from each novel, and then what artwork? Because sometimes the as good as the artwork was, the story wasn't as great as the artwork, in my opinion. But sometimes they were. But sometimes they weren't. You got 3 books worth of short stories. They're not all going to be hits. But the one in particular that stands out to me before you get to yours is the one where the woman goes to church and everyone at church is dead.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That kind of reminds me of the real Ghostbuster episode where the Ghostbusters go to Ray's cousin's house and she can't figure out why the farm won't grow any crops. And it's because the old dead farmers are coming at night, farming the lands and killing it with their, because they're falling apart. They're zombies basically, and they're filled with decay, and they're just bringing decay to the farm.
I love that one, and it hasn't come up as much as some other stories, but I like it. Part of it because it was an interesting thing because she was going to church, and so it had this interesting religious, connotation that didn't always pop up in other stories, but was there, and I thought was really interesting. And the illustration for that was quite good because it was just kind of this haunting image of the dead coming forward, and that was a great one. There's so many great illustrations. If I usually, the first story of the first book is called The Toe, and that's a classic. It's one of the jump stories, and some people immediately think, oh, they're all jump stories. Actually, only some of them were, but by jump story, it's one of those that builds up. It's like someone's coming, someone's getting closer, or something's happening, and there's this build up, and then at the end you jump out of the person and you go, you've got it, or whatever the jump may be. And so there were some of those, and The Toe is the first story from the first book, and it's a great illustration. It's just kind of a morbid illustration, but it was one of those where I feel like the things didn't looked kind of off, but you weren't exactly sure. The face it's clearly a child, but at the same time it almost looks like an old man. It's really it's morbid and great and fantastic. So that's usually one that I like to point out, or is one of my favorites, and is a favorite of many people's. Second book, The Bride, which is definitely a great illustration, but also just kind of a haunting tale of them playing hide and seek, and then they end up not, on a woman's wedding day, and they never find her. She disappears, and they find her years later. They open this chest, or whatever it may be, and she was hiding in this thing, stuck there for 10 years or whatever it was, and they just find a skeleton. I always thought it's like it's supposed to be your favorite day of your life, the best, greatest day of your life, and it ends up that way. It was very haunting. I always remember that was definitely one of my favorites. That was in the second book. And then the third book, I'll tell you right now, one that pops up very often is the story of Harold. Now, Harold is this scarecrow that a couple of young lads have fun with. They name him Harold because that's someone they're kind of making fun of, and they kind of bully this scarecrow, this that this doll essentially that they created, and Harold eventually begins to move and eventually talk and so on and so forth. Becomes animate, and then at the end of the story, he comes alive and kills them. Skins one of them alive. It's told really well. It's a haunting image at the very end, and then the image itself that goes along with it is fantastic too. So that's one that often pops up for a lot of people as far as stories that they remember, and is one of my favorites for sure too.
What will the DVD, Blu-ray, is it going to be DVD or Blu-ray documentary come with besides the documentary itself, and how long will the documentary be?
Still being determined. We're not quite done yet. We're aiming to finish this year, 2016, but we're still doing interviews as much as far as into this fall. I want it to be it's sure to be a full length documentary between the hour and hour and a half range. I'm working on a rough cut now that'll be about an hour, and I think it's going to extend beyond that. There's definitely some more things to work out, and people ask me, where can I get this? Is it going to be on this, that, and the other? I'm like, I don't know at this point. I'm working hard. I have most of it filmed. We may have to crowdfund again to finish post-production. But we're in a pretty good place to finish it in 2016 and have it available in some capacity in 2017.
What type of bonus material will be on it?
That's a good question. Probably just more footage, and might be extended stuff that of people that it didn't quite fit in the story arc that we had in the documentary. But it's like, oh, but that was such a great moment with R.L. Stine, or that was such a great moment with one of the family members that we want to have a little nugget. So, but it's hard to tell at this point because we're still working on that final draft. But I would imagine there'll be some additional things at the end that's like fun little things that didn't quite make the cut.
If people didn't get on the initial Kickstarter or crowdfunding, I forget what website you went with, can they still contribute and get a copy of it? Will it be out in stores?
Probably. I mean, I would definitely try to follow. I've got a newsletter. I only use it for when there's big news available. And you can go to our website, scarystoriesdoc.com. And really, you can just Google Scary Stories to Tell in Dark Documentary. You'll find us real quickly. And on that site is a newsletter. There's hundreds of people on it now. I'd love for hundreds of more to be on it, and I just use it when there's big news. So when there is big news, I'll let you know definitely through that. You can also follow us. I'm very active on Twitter and Instagram, and Facebook. Scary Stories Doc or Scary Stories Movie in the case of Facebook. But anyways, I'll let people know when I know for sure. Newsletter is probably the best way to find out because, like I said, there's still some things in the air as far as A, finishing it, and B, where is it going to be when it is finished, that sort of thing.
Do you hope to get like a big wide release with the company?
It ultimately comes down to I want to get the widest release that I can get. With documentaries, a lot of times it is some kind of online streaming service, and so I'd love for that. I'd love to have a very probably very limited theater distribution, but I'm also not making any promises with that. Like I said, a lot of times with documentaries, the online route is probably the widest distribution you're ever going to get, and that's actually what people come to me saying, is it going to be on this or is it going to be on that? It's like, so that's usually the widest distribution you can hope to have. Yeah, but like I said, it's still kind of up in the air.
Are you going to have any maybe reading of the original Scary Stories by somebody with a really cool voice? Maybe some celebrity that with a voice that's always been synonymous with great voice acting. Maybe read a story as a bonus material on the DVD?
That's actually, I mean, we have that. There will definitely be some of that in the documentary. Sometimes it's incredibly helpful to have that setup of, a story being told, and we've already filmed some of that. Have plans for a little bit more. So yes, there will definitely be some readings, and that's something that we can. That's not an adaptation of the story. And the interesting thing about this is one topic that comes up is the idea of storytelling and how important that is to children, and how much it matters how you tell it, right? That's what the author Alvin Schwartz often stressed was, it's not just a matter of telling a story, but telling a story well makes a huge difference. And that's horror. But that's storytelling in general, and certainly storytelling with children. It matters how you tell the story, and so you can best demonstrate that when you have a really good storyteller. Telling the heck out of a good story, and really embellishing and going off on tangents, and so many of these stories are trapped in time on the pages of this book, which is fantastic, and people appreciate that. But at the same time, they're folklore, and they're meant to be retold and told in slightly different ways, because that's folklore, and that's a healthy thing.
Besides scary stories to tell at night, what other horror influenced you besides maybe like Stephen King? You mentioned, of course, R.L. Stine was a big favorite of mine as well. Is there anything anyone else that maybe we're not aware of that you could give us some insight into your own love of horror when you were a kid?
Sure. One of my favorites. I moved on, right around that same time. I was a big Christopher Pike fan. And
oh yeah, Christopher Pike.
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't get a lot of love these days, and I don't even know is he even still alive?
He's still around. He's actually, he'll post something on Facebook every once in a while, because I follow him on Facebook, and it's always interesting because he says, "This is me," and I believe his real name is Kevin.
Oh,
totally, I haven't done my research, but I follow him sometimes every once in a while, and I still kind of keep up with it, because he talk about adapting. And a couple of his books have been adapted. The vampire one series that I was a big fan of when I was a kid.
The Last Vampire.
Yeah, Last Vampire. That's real popular, and they've kind of, similar to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and some of R.L. Stine's books, they re-release, and they have different covers, and they're revamped a little bit, maybe switched up a little bit here and there, but, they're kind of repackaged for another generation, and they've definitely done that with The Last Vampire. But he had a bunch of others, and some of them were very Twilight Zone-ish, and some of them got into religion. The Last Vampire, definitely. I mean, it was very kind of it had some really interesting religious themes running throughout that I always thought was really interesting, completely different. It was just like, whoa, no other horror book I'm reading right now gets into that, and it was really very interesting. So yeah, Christopher Pike was a big one for me.
Yeah, I almost completely forgot about him, just because you don't hear about him in the news almost at all.
Yeah, I think he started to publish a little bit more independently, and maybe there's been frustrations with trying to package his books for other generations and that sort of thing. I say that having not done my research as far as what's really the case, but I think he probably hasn't been publishing as much as he'd like, but I think he's also acknowledged that and said he's been trying to, and that sort of thing. And maybe there's a little bit of the interest in adapting his into films and whatnot, and that kind of being a tiresome thing, I can imagine. I think R.L. Stine did it really well, and I'm interested to see how they do Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, because that's being adapted. But it can also, for someone who really cares about how it's done, and it's a tricky thing to do, maybe it can be kind of, like I said, tiresome. That it's just a guess, though.
Now, wasn't there some controversy with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark recently because they changed all of the artwork and everyone hated? Like, I don't remember one. And I mean this seriously to anyone listening to this, either online live or later on when we post this on YouTube, show me, post in the comments below, a happy, smiley, good article about the artwork changed for this. Nobody I know liked the new artwork. Now, I assume that it has to do with copyright. You tell me the story. You're the keys of the documentary.
I wouldn't go that far with it.
Again, I assume I made an ass out of you and me.
My guess is that I haven't talked to the publishers. I probably won't. But admittedly...
Oh, so you're not going to include this new artwork into your documentary?
No. There's a whole section on the original artwork. I'm only very... I am touching on the controversy of the new artwork, but I'm really concentrating on the old artwork. By
good, very good.
So I have some speculation. By that, why I said that is I have some speculation as far as why the decision was made to change the artwork. I definitely have a ton of people who talk about how it was horrible the artwork was changed. My assumption is, and I have the family of the author talking about it a little bit. My assumption is that they had no idea that it was a big deal. They actually got a really gifted illustrator for it. There's nothing wrong with the new illustrations. I have a long section of my documentary devoted to Stephen Gamble and his artwork because it transcends what so many people thought artwork should do, in a children's books, and it's fantastic. My guess is the publishers just didn't understand, this is a very popular title. Well, they've switched out illustrators for other children's books, no one seems to care. So let's switch out this one and, let's repackage it for the anniversary, yada, 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 and let's just do it. My guess is they had no idea that they would be like, oh my gosh, this isn't what we grew up with. We love Stephen Gamble's artwork. It belonged with these stories because that's what we grew up on. And the interesting thing I'm kind of touching on is there's been controversy, there's an interesting relationship with illustrations and children's stories. And sometimes they're so interconnected that, they almost don't belong being separated from each other because, even though they are very often created completely separately, right? As far as I can tell, Stephen Gamble and Alvin Schwartz never actually met. And that is very actually common for children's books. Usually they are, created completely separately. So it's the fact that, there was this outcry with the artwork being changed is being addressed. Definitely, you can't not bring it up because that made a huge controversy, several years back when that happened. So we're definitely touching on it, but I'm a big fan of just propping up that original artwork because it's fantastic, and that's what so many of us remembered from these books growing up. And I'm spending about as much time on the illustrations as I am the stories. They're both being talked about a lot.
Give out your social media so everyone can find you, as well as help continue to contribute to back-end crowdfunding or whatever that's called.
Sure, thanks. So our website is scarystoriesdoc.com, and you can get to our social media from that website, or you can go straight to Twitter at scarystoriesdoc, Instagram it's scarystoriesdoc, and Facebook it's Scary Stories Movie. So you can definitely find us. I'm very active on those, and I share all kinds of fun stuff on those. So you can definitely find us. And we may be crowdfunding again this fall. It's a little bit up in the air, but we're definitely, and you can also sign up on our newsletter through our website.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I really do appreciate you coming on the show. As soon as I heard about this documentary, I was like, oh my God, this is great. I missed the crowdfunding, but again, be part of this amazing documentary, which we're really looking forward to next year. And in a renaissance of horror documentaries that have been coming out, we have Fright Night, we just had Hellraiser, we have RoboCop coming out next year, we have He-Man coming out next year, We have Cody's documentary. We have
these ones I haven't heard of. Now I'm googling.
Okay, there's a Fright Night one. There was a Hellraiser one from the same people that made the Fright Night one. There was a Pet Sematary one. There's a RoboCop documentary coming out. There's a video game artwork documentary coming out. There is a He-Man and the Masters of the Universe documentary coming out.
I have that Nightmare on Elm Street one. I've watched. It's like 4 hours long. I don't care. I've seen that multiple times. I love it. I'm gonna have to look up these other ones.
Yeah, definitely. Just definitely look for them. You can go to my YouTube page, Radio of Horror, to see the interviews I've done for some of these documentaries. One company's made 3. Again, as I listed, Hellraiser, Fright Night, and they have RoboCop. Fright Night is coming out in October, hopefully. Oh, Juliet Landau, she has a documentary coming out with Gary Oldman and Joss Whedon about vampires in movies and television.
Awesome.
Yeah, which, if anyone who's not familiar, Juliet Landau played Drusilla on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. Gary Oldman played Dracula in Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. And, of course, Joss Whedon, long before he was making the Avenger movies, he created Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Again, Cody, thank you so much for coming on the show.
All right, thanks a lot for having me.